Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Mohammed Saad Ul Haque, a research analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode, which looks at the history of the Indus Water Treaty. In the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in Pahalgam in late April, the government of India announced the immediate abeyance of the Indus Water Treaty. Signed in 1960 between India and Pakistan, the Indus Water Treaty was brokered by the World Bank amidst rising post-partition tensions and concerns regarding the sharing of water. The treaty allocated control of the Indus River water system's waters, aiming to prevent further disputes. It's withstood multiple conflicts and hostilities, but now, after the worst conflict between the two sides in decades, its future is uncertain. To speak about the history of the treaty and the context behind its signing, we are pleased to have join us David Gilmartin, Professor of History at North Carolina State University. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Before we kind of get into the treaty itself and when it was signed, I think a good place to start would be to if you could shed some light on some of the concerns and discussions regarding the sharing of water between a future state of Pakistan and India uh, during the last few years leading up to the partition.
Yes, okay. Before Pakistan was created, you mean
Yep.
in the
Yep. Yeah.
yeah. So there was a considerable amount of developing tension over distribution of water, really intensifying during the 1930s and 1940s. Though the nature of that conflict was quite different from what came afterward, because the major focus was problems relating to water allocations to Sindh and to Punjab. Um, and these had some significant long-term effects. For example, the history of the Bakra Dam in Punjab, which was one of the first major dams in the Indus system that opened in the 1950s in India. This was a dam which had been discussed going back almost 50 years before that time. And one of the huge questions that slowed down any development of the dam was the question as to whether it would impound water which otherwise would be allocated to Sindh. And so there were major negotiations, and there was a committee appointed in the 1930s that worked on developing allocations, and most importantly, a committee by Justice Rao in the 1940s. Um, the Indus Commission tried to develop principles for the allocation of water between provinces. So that was the basic kind of structure of conflict which developed before 1947. But of course, that took a very um, different direction after partition.
Mhm.
Um, and just to say before we go on and talk about some of these things, one of the key issues surrounding partition and its relationship to water was that the partition was really undertaken with very little serious attention to water issues. So there were some specific conflicts that developed about the partition line relating to the Madhopur headworks on the Ravi and the Firozpur headworks on the Sutlej. And the line had some impact on how Pakistan's access to water from those rivers might develop, and there was some conflict about this. But having said that, in terms of the structure of the whole basin and its water needs, these were minor issues. And in fact, Radcliffe, who drew the line, understood that this was going to have a serious impact on the irrigation system in the region. And this was probably the most important of the so-called other factors that he was allowed to take into account beyond just religious identity. Um, and at one point, we don't have much documentation on this, but at one point he apparently um, made a suggestion to both Nehru and to Jinnah that some arrangement should be made in advance for mutual operation of the system. And it was really dismissed without much serious consideration at all at that time. So partition really came as a division which cut across the water system with very little attention to what the implications of that might be. And that's what set the stage for the post-47 conflicts.
Right. So, with that in mind, how soon after partition did both sides kind of realize that they need to find some sort of agreement or some sort of solution to the crisis?
Yeah, so that's a great question because even in the immediate aftermath of partition, there was relatively little recognition of the potential for conflict that would be wrapped up in the water system. Um, so what happened was in late 1947, the chief engineers of West Punjab and East Punjab signed what they called a standstill agreement,
Mhm.
which, without really tackling the issue, basically said, you know, for the moment, we're just going to maintain pre-partition allocations. And that was to last until March 31st, 1948. And then what happened was the next day, April
Mhm.
1st, India stopped the flow of water in the particularly in the upper Bari Doab system. So these were not all the canals that took water into Pakistan from what had become Indian territory, but this was in central Punjab and including a canal, a branch of the Upper Bari Doab Canal, the Lahore branch, which runs right through the city of Lahore between the civil lines and the cantonment.
Mhm.
And so the water just stopped in April. And this is what really galvanized a sense that, you know, in Pakistan in particular, that India has a potential stranglehold over, you know, Pakistan's well-being through
Mhm.
this control of water. And so that led to the first serious meeting on this was in May 1948.
Mhm.
A meeting was held, an inter-Dominion conference in Delhi. And that's where the first serious discussion about what would happen
Mhm.
occurred. But the interesting thing about it was that there were various things agreed to, including Pakistani recognition that India had control over the water that flowed through East Punjab, and that this was um, a basically a result of partition. But what happened was Pakistan agreed to some of these issues and then subsequently basically repudiated the agreements under the argument that this had all been done under duress
Mhm.
because they had to make these agreements to get the water started again flowing into the canals. So then that was the beginning, both of some real kind of popular engagement with this, but also the beginning of gradually long-term negotiations were set up.
Mhm.
And so that was the start. And so it was from the very beginning, the issue was negotiated under the backdrop of the threat of India's to stop water flowing into Pakistan because India was the upper riparian, and so
Mhm.
they had that power.
Okay, so Pakistan felt like it was threatened, or it was for them it was
Absolutely.
okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely felt it was threatened. And because you know all of the major rivers that provide irrigation in Punjab, with the exception of the Indus itself, flow through either Indian territory or through Kashmir.
Hmm.
And only the Indus does not actually flow through any territory controlled by India. But even that's the case now. But even it flows through parts of Kashmir that are now controlled by Pakistan.
So I was actually gonna touch on this next. Uh, the unresolved nature of Kashmir at the time in the 50s.
Mm.
How much of an impact did this have on this specific issue of water? As you mentioned that, the flow also stems from there. So is did it have an impact on how both countries viewed Kashmir and also how both countries viewed the issue of water allocation?
Yeah, I mean, there's no way Kashmir couldn't have some impact given the geographic realities of water flow in the region.
Right.
But having said that, I mean, the basic framework of the whole treaty that eventually was signed in 1960,
Hmm.
the whole framework was predicated on creating an agreement that would basically avoid dealing with the Kashmir issue at all.
Right.
So what that meant was that Kashmir was basically left out of the agreement.
Hmm.
I mean, it couldn't be entirely because there were various arrangements related to what rights India had or didn't have on the so-called Western rivers that flow into Pakistan. Um, but having said that, it was. I mean, this is where India and Pakistan actually had something in common, which facilitated the treaty. Namely, both of them were happy to basically avoid dealing with Kashmir within the context of the water issue. And
Hmm.
so this is where a lot of the subsequent problems with the treaty have arisen because there was no serious thought given to water allocations for Kashmir itself. I mean, to say there was none is not entirely correct because, of course, the issue did come up. But basically, there was very little, and even on the Indian side, um, even in terms of control of the eastern rivers, India, uh, the central government brokered a water sharing agreement between Punjab and basically Rajasthan
Hmm.
in 1955. Punjab yet wasn't consolidated at that point, but and there were allocations for Rajasthan and for Punjab. At that time, there were two separate Punjabs, which were later consolidated. And for Delhi and for Kashmir, though Kashmir was given, I can't remember the exact figure, but a very small
Hmm.
percentage of the water. So there was not much kind of thought given to the development of Kashmir in the context of the treaty on either side.
Right. So then was the treaty, the manner in which it was signed, was it intended to be something permanent, or was there any room, or did the both sides ever envision that they would kind of in the future, in maybe 10, 15 years, sit down and renegotiate or kind of relook at the details?
I mean, there was some recognition that realities would change,
Mm.
and part there were a few important elements in the treaty which had to do with cooperation between Pakistan and India, including sharing of data about water flows, and all of that suggested that there was an awareness that having a sense of what was changing and what was going on uh, with the river flow in general was important to the treaty. But having said that, the whole structure of the treaty, I mean, not only was it structured to avoid dealing with Kashmir, but it was structured in order to minimize the need for cooperation between India and Pakistan. So this idea was that, India would be given the three eastern rivers, the Beas, the Satluj, and the Ravi, and Pakistan would be given the Chenab, the Jhelum, and the Indus. And so the idea was that the actual environmental situation, namely that India was the upper riparian and Pakistan was the lower riparian,
Mhm.
and that the key problem was that water flows downhill and it all flowed from India into Pakistan, which you would think would require cooperation over water flow. But the answer was, let's pretend there's no issue of upper riparian and lower riparian. Let's break apart the different rivers within the basin and give them in their entirety to one side or the other.
Mhm.
So that was the basic
Right.
logic of the treaty. And that was, yeah, that was thought to be the best long-term solution because it meant that India and Pakistan could basically go their separate developmental ways.
Okay. So then, sorry, with
Yeah,
that
sorry.
with that in mind, obviously after 1960, there's been multiple times where the relations between two countries have been increasingly um, uh, tarnished. So there was 65, obviously, there was a conflict, 71 in Siachen too. So before the recent abeyance of the treaty, has there been any other times where the treaty's existence has been in question, where either both sides have felt about perhaps renegotiating or even pulling out of it immediately entirely?
Well, I mean, there have been some suggestions about need for renegotiation of some aspects, which go back some ways into, I forget when the first serious questions arose about whether certain things needed to be changed, but certainly they go back to maybe 1980s, 1990s.
Mhm.
Um, and there have been questions since then, including some questions increasingly being raised about whether the whole treaty needs to be renegotiated. So a lot of that, I mean, a lot of that is connected, as you just suggested, to changing relations between India and Pakistan. But
Mhm.
it's also related to the fact that the key issue that was really left out of the treaty was exactly how water could be used within its framework for developmental projects in Kashmir.
Mhm.
And basically the treaty's answer to that, though India and Pakistan have since the 1980s not really agreed wholly on what the treaty says on this,
Mhm.
but is that, that projects that use the water of the Jhelum and Chenab as they flow through Kashmir uh, are all right within the framework of the treaty, so long as water is returned to the river in ways that does not significantly diminish the flow to Pakistan. That is, Pakistan interprets this to mean it has a right under the treaty to uh, uh, more or less the amounts of water that it has always claimed.
Mhm.
And so all of these projects, that have come up since then, beginning really with the Kishan Ganga project, have gone to some form of arbitration under the terms of the treaty. And India has had to make modifications to projects, and Pakistan has disputed the grounding of these projects in the structure of the treaty. So that has been ongoing.
Mhm.
Um, what is really been new lately, and what the forerunner to the current, announcement that India is going to hold the treaty in abeyance, is the articulation, which really came after Modi came into power, which the articulation of the notion that the treaty could be used as a lever of pressure with respect to issues of terrorism
Hmm.
within India, within Kashmir in particular, in which India accuses Pakistan of having a hand.
Hmm.
And so Modi had said way back in, I think it was 2016, after one incident in Kashmir, that, that's the first time he used this phrase that blood and water cannot flow together,
Hmm.
that you can't have a treaty that allows water flows and at the same time have conflicts that are involving attacks across the border.
Hmm.
And so that has been going on for almost 10 years. So the latest announcement that they're holding the treaty in abeyance is really a continuation of
Hmm.
that. Um, but in terms of what's going on now, I mean, I don't really know all the ins and outs of what is going on and what everybody is saying about this. But just to say, as far as I understand it, there's no provision in the treaty that allows India to say they're holding it in abeyance.
Right.
The treaty has provisions for changes to be renegotiated between
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
parties. There's no clause that says that either party can pull out whenever they decide it's not in their interests.
Right.
So India is operating, when they say they're holding it in abeyance, they're operating in a very gray legal area
Hmm.
on this, which raises real questions as to how much of this is rhetorical and how much of this is going to actually reflect any significant changes in
Right.
how the two countries deal with water issues.
Okay, so I think another thing that the Indian government has maintained is that the treaty was signed under the prevailing Cold War politics at the time, and that it was inherently unfair on India. Um,
Yeah.
from your understanding, is there any real substance to this claim, and uh, it's the features that are in the treaty itself? Did it favor one side over another at first glance?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, but it really hinges on what the expectation of the two parties were. So India started out in these negotiations asserting that as the upper riparian, it had complete right to any waters that flow through Indian territory, so that India was under no obligation to let any water at all flow into Pakistan.
Hmm.
And in fact, in the early years, India invoked this, what was called the Harman Doctrine, which goes back to US relations with Mexico at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century,
Hmm.
in which the US basically asserted the right that we can do whatever we want with the water that flows through our territory. But by the time you got to the Indus Waters negotiation, this had been quite generally repudiated in water dealings throughout the world.
Hmm.
And so the much more prevalent view was that the upper riparian had certain obligations to let water flow where it was already in use. It was already appropriated for beneficial use downstream. And so, if you start from the idea that India had total rights, then one could say, yeah, from that perspective, India gave something up in the treaty when it agreed to this division of the rivers. Um, but in fact, if you look at, the long-term trajectory on this division, so this was a division. India and Pakistan began serious negotiating after we just talked about this, after the Inter-Dominion conference.
Mhm.
And then in 1951, the World Bank came into these negotiations as a mediator.
Mhm.
Um, and then in 1954, it was the World Bank that proposed this division of the rivers to kind of break through what was then an impasse. And if you go back and look at that time, it was Pakistan which was most outraged at this proposal, because
Right.
this proposal basically said that Pakistan has no rights in the water of the Sutlej
Mhm.
and the Beas, even though these waters were critical to there had been this pre-partition Sutlej Valley project in southern Punjab, which made extensive use of the water of the Sutlej.
Mhm.
And so Pakistan claimed under international law they had the right to the continuation of this. And basically, this agreement to just give 3 rivers to one and 3 to the other basically abandoned that notion. That the bank basically said, no one is going to insist on that right. So it was Pakistan, when that was proposed, their negotiators for a while talked about leaving the negotiations altogether. They felt this was a totally undercut their negotiating
Mhm.
position. So from that perspective, in point of fact, the argument in Pakistan that the treaty was unfair is made quite commonly, or was made quite commonly. And it's hard to give credence to an argument that it was India that really sacrificed everything, while Pakistan got the rights to these rivers. So no, I wouldn't buy into that argument. But basically, the structure of the treaty, it was that Pakistan gave up its rights to this water that had previously flowed into it. And what allowed them to do that, and this was absolutely integral to the treaty,
Mhm.
was that Pakistan was given a huge international aid package to
Mhm.
completely restructure its irrigation system in order to move water from the western rivers to irrigate the lands that had formerly been irrigated by the 3 eastern rivers. So India was technically forced to pay some compensation to Pakistan for the fact that they were going to stop some of the flows that previously went into Pakistan. But in point of fact, what made the treaty possible was this huge international intervention, which
Mhm.
certainly was tied into the Cold War
Right.
and certainly played a big role in cementing Pakistan's position as part of, this Cold War American alliance.
Mhm.
Um, so that's certainly true. But the fact is, it was India's position in the negotiations, which in part made that necessary. There would have been no agreement
Mhm.
without this huge aid package. This is what
Right.
bought Pakistan's agreement in signing the treaty.
Mhm. So then, in light of everything we've discussed today, going forward, where does Pakistan go? What options are available to Pakistan? Obviously, there's some issues they have in Sindh regarding water as well, and they
Yeah.
have a poor history of water management too. So where do they go from here?
Yeah. Well, Pakistan has huge issues in water management, as you probably know. And some of those go back to the colonial period because, I mean, it's always been the case, and this was the case under the British, that um, the, you know, relative yields from when measured by quantities of water for irrigation, have always been very low in the Indus Basin by international standards. And that in part is due to the British structure where they developed this system to spread water to cover as much land as was possible, which really had political motivations because irrigation was a tool of control.
Mhm.
And so Pakistan lives with the legacies of that, as does India. So yeah, there are all kinds of problems that Pakistan has with its irrigation system. Of course, India has serious problems too, including really serious groundwater depletion issues, which in some ways are more serious in India than they are in
Mhm.
Pakistan. But the real question about where does Pakistan go from here? So the question is whether changes in the treaty are going to have any significant impact on any of those issues or not. And in my view, it's much too early to say that. I mean, if India should seriously reduce the flow of water going into Pakistan, this would have huge consequences. But it's hard, at least for me, to imagine that India would do that
Mhm.
because that would bounce back against India itself and would
Mhm.
severely hurt India's standing, not to mention the fact that India itself is the lower riparian in northeastern India.
Right.
And so for them to try to assert we have the right nowadays to just stop water with dams being built on the Brahmaputra River would just be like shooting themselves in the foot.
Mhm.
So I don't think that's going to happen. I can't imagine that unless there's real political pressures that India is going to significantly change what goes on with
Mhm.
the management of the system as it stands. But I have no crystal ball, so we'll
It's
see.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a very great discussion. You were listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on our research and publications through social media, and you can find us on X, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you.